Hi, I'm Marilyn Hamilton, and I'd like to welcome you to the Integral City Growing Up series of interviews. Today, I'm joined by a very important member of our community of practice, Pieter Wackers, and I'm just going to find out from Pieter how he got connected with Integral City and how he's using it in his own professional practice. So I'd like to invite Pieter to just start off by telling us where you're located, Pieter, and what is your work? And welcome this morning.
Yeah, thank you. I'm located in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands. And asking me what my work is always a very complex question because there's so many different things and many things that don't necessarily have names. So I started out as a visual artist, focusing on public space. So that's one of the places where the connection with Integral City comes in. And I'm a video maker, and I'm working with a lot of different groups and projects on, I would say, things that are very aligned with what Integral City is trying to do. So for example, I'm working with the Hague Center for Global Governance, Innovation and Emergence, where we try to make connections, like make meshworks as well. We might get to that later. So bringing together all these people who are doing, let's say, their own bit on creating living cities that work, and bring that together and seeing how we can find new ways of collaborating as well. And I think a lot of what I do is sort of related to that.
Thanks, Pieter. It seems that most of us are doing this work are kind of hybrids. So I'm not surprised when you say you can't just give a one-line answer to what your work is. And it seems like you maybe are creating it as you're called into living your purpose or feeling that you're making a contribution to the world. Would that be fair to say that that's why you have such a breadth of experience and interests?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that, so for one thing, I think I'm still figuring it out myself in a way. And I think another thing is that I actively try to sort of bridge those different worlds. So I have a lot of different stories about what I do, and one of them is that I am a translator, so that I try to translate between literally between different languages sometimes, but also between different ways of thinking, like between linear and visual thinking, or between different value systems and different worldviews. So yeah.
That's really powerful, because when people ask me about how Integral City uses ways to frame worldviews and values, and a lot of us use integral lenses or spiral dynamics integral, and I always say that it isn't just a matter of transformation, but translation, that's the real challenge. That's the real skill that we need to invite into the world. So it's really powerful to hear you call yourself a translator. I'd recommend you keep that title, because it translates across a lot of different domains. Yeah. So Pieter, today I wanted to invite you to just tell us a little bit of a story about how you connected with Integral City. And I thought we'd start at the beginning. Where did you originally encounter Integral City, and what made you decide to move forward with it in your life?
Yeah, that's quite a while ago. I think it was 2012 that we first met. I first encountered Integral City when I first encountered you. I was taking part in an architecture competition called Energetic City 2050, where we were asked to make a design for the city of the future, basically. And Marilyn was one of the speakers there on the very first day of that competition. And so you gave an introduction about Integral City. And at that point, like I know it was very inspiring, and being like I remember being attracted to like that way of looking at cities, and in the end we didn't really find a way to incorporate it into our design at that point, but it was something that stayed in the back of my mind. Like I would like to know more about it. I had a feeling like this is something that is so nuanced, let's say, that it wasn't something I could directly use in any way, but it felt like I want to learn more about it so I can go deeper into it. And so I think a couple of years later, I decided, okay, now is the time. I read the book So that was a start, and then I wanted to know more. So I got in touch with Peter Mary, who put me in touch with Annemarie Voorhoeven, who was working with you. So there was, at the time I knew there were two books that I thought like, this is interesting, and it was Integral City and one of Evan Laszlo's books. And then when I spoke to Annemarie, who was working with both you and Evan Laszlo, I thought, okay, this is a good place. And then from there, I sort of gradually got more involved.
Lots of synchronies involved. And I remember that project, and it was Energetic City 2050, and it was located in Arnhem, if I'm remembering correctly. And
yeah.
I remember the name of your team's project was Energy. Am I remembering that right? Yes. And
yeah.
And what inspired me about that was that you looked at the opportunities to generate energy from inner energy, not just external energy. And I thought that really did connect well with the way I was seeing that cities had meta intelligences, and that actually found a way. You might not have seen it at the time, but it was something that to me felt like, oh, this is very out on the leading edge of how somebody might take the intelligences of an integral city and apply them. So it's interesting that your perspective was that it wasn't a direct connection. I'm very glad that you were inspired, and that led you to connect directly with me in the book. But I was also inspired by the way that your transdisciplinary team worked that time. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that I wasn't aware of the connection. I think I felt the connection, but I couldn't find like a direct, explicit way of I mean, there was a lot that I didn't know at the time that I know. Like I've learned a lot since then, and yeah. So for me, that was just more to learn before I could really sort of see where the connection was. That maybe intuitively I knew that was there.
Okay, so that's really leading into the next question I have for you was, how have you gone about learning and expanding your way of experiencing and applying Integral City? What has been your learning journey?
I think it's also has many different facets. So it started with the books. I am one of those people who like really like the books. And book one also. It seems there's two types of people in Integral City, like people who get in, like who like the books, and people who get in other ways. And I'm one of those people who also, like, for me, the book was a very important starting point, I would say. But it's also like in being, I've been at some point I joined the community of practice, our core group, and the meetings once a month. That was a big one as well. To first of all to sort of experience that we space. So that was a really strange experience for me, like to come in to a group of people I mostly had never met, let alone seen face to face. It was all online, and to immediately sort of feel the coherence of that group and to feel that I was part of that. And I never experienced anything like that in another group. That it's sort of let's say the strength of that, as you call it, we space. But so to be part of that and to hear from all the other people in that group, that I think was a big way of learning. Also to start to apply it. What was it, 2 years ago I started teaching together with Marilyn,
Yes.
with you, the Beyond Smart courses. And I mean, if you want to learn anything, then teach it. That's really a very good way of learning. And I'm probably forgetting some other ways, but these are some of them.
Yeah, so that is one of the edicts I sort of use, is teach what you want to learn, because it always extends and stretches me. Did you find that as you taught, the ways that people learned and just working with people who were also on a learning path helped to expand your own understanding and depth of knowledge?
Yeah, both that and so seeing something teaches you to a certain level, being able to like integrating it enough to be able to reproduce it and to respond to questions that you get, like requires sort of a different kind of framing or something for myself to know, okay, I felt like I sort of had to structure it differently in my mind in order to have everything ready when I needed it.
Yeah, that's great. And I must say that it's been really good for me too, to have somebody to co-teach with, because I think it not only that sort of takes the teaching and learning into a different direction, because I found that we resonated well as a teaching team. And so you would bring different lenses or weights or interests to certain aspects of the frameworks we were teaching. And by the same token, you would sort of listen to me and say, oh, maybe I hadn't heard it that way before, and be able to respond to that. And I think we were able to create a way to involve our learners, our audience, in a different way than just one of us teaching at a time. Was that a similar experience for you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember any of the learners in particular that sort of woke you up and said, wow, this is somebody who's going to start to move us forward and will have their own path to open up from an Integral City perspective?
I wouldn't have like one person. One of the things that struck me is that each group was so different. And so, and that also, so to see that how different groups of learners like really take you into a different direction, and that it apply like Integral City applies for all of them. Like that also for me was another example of how many different, how nuanced it is, or how many different sides there are to it.
Yeah, that's a really great point too. And I do remember that we had relatively small cohorts with Beyond Smart, but that gave us a lot of opportunity to spend time with the individuals and be able to draw them out. And some of them were brand new to the idea, and others were very experienced, and somehow they could bring wherever they were in their learning journey, and we were able to work with them. So I think that for myself, in working with bringing voice to these frameworks for Integral City, it's helpful to know that meeting people where they're at can be translated. And so your presence in translating that was also really valuable for me. Peter, I'd like to find out a little bit more about how you've taken the Integral City frameworks into all the many different kinds of work that you do, and how do you yourself create initiatives that go beyond the interactions that we've had directly, but you just see as opportunities in the world.
Yeah, there's so I would say for Integral City there are like sometimes I use it explicitly, and sometimes I just like it's just the insights that have come from Integral City, but also from a lot of different places that all inform, what I do. I feel like there are some things in Integral City that are that really speak to people very directly. So, for example, the idea of the 4 voices, like in any project, that's a good lens to see. Like, are we involving, let's say, a whole representation of whatever system we're working with, so that we're not just focusing on one group, but always thinking about, okay, who else should be at the table. And then, and especially in cities, to just the 4 voices is just a very easy and very powerful one to look at. One of the things that I have, if I think about like what I've been doing recently, one of the things where I would quite often mention Integral City is when looking at meshworks, because like I said, in the Hague Center, we're working a lot with meshworking. And one of the things that I personally took from teaching Beyond Smart is that there are different ways that the word meshwork is used. So that it is sort of a description of something that occurs naturally, like how it's a description of how our brain works and how cities work and how complex systems and sort of need a combination of self-organizing capacities and structuring hierarchies, and to bring in some kind of efficiency. And so it's a description of that. That's something that, like, those sort of that combination of self-organizing and structures, like that is something that I use all the time. But also the distinction, like when we're talking about meshworks, we can be talking about something that just happens, and we can also talk about the practice of strengthening that capacity. And then there is another, let's say, the meshworking TM, like the method as described by Don Beck, and that the Higgs Center also has worked with a lot. So yeah, that's for example, one example where I use what I've learned in teaching.
Thanks, Peter. Meshworking is, of course, also very dear to my heart, and you've given us a sort of a quick explanation of the intelligence of meshworking in an integral city is this combination of the two operating systems, self-organizing and structuring hierarchies. And I know that you have also, aside from working with the Higgs Center, I think you've been doing some teaching yourself. So you started your own journey as an artist and working with an architecture team. I think you've been working in architecture again. Could you tell us a little bit more about those experiences?
Which experience are you?
You were teaching.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a. I even forgot about that. It's a good one. Yeah, I've been giving some workshops for the Academy of Architecture. And this was for the pre-master urbanism and landscape architecture, and I was asked to give a workshop to people who have some kind of background in architecture and some kind of design, but want to move into urbanism or landscape architecture. And when I was asked to help give that workshop, I thought, like, let's bring in this perspective, to not just look at the design in, on the outside of the design, let's say the right-hand quadrants, but also look at really sort of bring in that perspective that there are different lenses through which you can look at the design. And I literally brought in the 4 voices there to give the students an idea, like, these people all interact with, will be interacting with your design. So what happens if you look at what you're designing through those eyes?
And was that something that the students could easily follow, or was this a whole new adventure for them?
For many, it was a whole new adventure, and I think they all did very well, and I think they all really enjoyed it also. But I really think that introduced a new perspective for them. And yeah, you could notice that some at first, like, some people were really struggling with thinking about, like, what does a city manager do, or what does what does the civil society do?
Yeah, they had to learn how to walk in the shoes of those different voices. Yeah. Yes, understand. And you invited me to observe the presentation, the final classes of one of those groups, and I thought was very impressed with how they did manage to integrate, and how they talked about, because I think, if I remember correctly, they were working in like different teams, or almost like charrette-like, and working with this very central area of Amsterdam, and being able to talk about what they had at first considered doing and then what they ended up doing. I felt that what you had brought into the students, they had run with being able to have the whole system be able to both inform the design and also to be able to live in it, work in it, and flow through it. So it was something that sort of sticks in my mind. I thought that the way they presented it reminded me of Christopher Alexander, and how he looks at the sort of the hull of the neighborhoods in an area, and that he looks at living systems. That's his whole basis for architecture. And I felt like they were actually translating some of those principles into how they were doing their work. So I would say very well done. I really appreciate that. And it was wonderful to have that sort of feedback loop of seeing it being applied in a real city, in a real place, and that I could even imagine, because I've been there. Yeah, so that was very powerful. So thanks for that story. Now, Peter, I know you're working with the Higgs Center, and they've been looking at governance from the heart, or heart-centered governance. Have you got any stories about how integral city frameworks are contributing to that kind of work?
That for me, that's sort of yeah, that's a good question, because that's this is one of the areas where it's very hard to say what comes from where.
Yes.
And here I have a feeling that this is really sort of I would say like a community of practice that are trying to learn together. So, I mean, one of the what I remember is that, for example, working with constellation work, like one of the things that you want to do is to not only listen to the four voices in the city, but also listen to the city itself. Like the city has its own consciousness and its own spirit, and there are different ways of listening to that. But one of the ways that I think works very well is working with systemic constellation work, and I've heard some stories about constellations done with Integral City that still inform my way of looking at the city, at Amsterdam, for example. But that's where I think like the Integral City and the Hague Center have the same like lead constellator, Diana Claire Douglas. So there is, where is it Integral City frameworks? Where is it? This is really, I think, sort of where, learning and developing together.
Yeah, that's a really good intersection point, because Diana Claire Douglas was the person when I was living in Canada who helped me to bring systemic constellation work into Integral City. However, I learned systemic constellation work in Europe in person, working with predecessors of the Hague Center. And so they certainly impacted me. And when I was able to have those experiences in person, then I'm very happy, given this last year of the pandemic that's put us under lockdown and required us to work online. But then Diana Claire Douglas has adapted the whole approach to systemic constellation work to be able to do it at distance online. And so I think that that's a beautiful weaving of ways that we can help our approaches, our methodology. So systemic constellation work for me is a way of knowing. It's both an epistemology that allows us to, I said when I first encountered it, well, this gives me access to the invisible aspects of the city, as you pointed to, the consciousness and the spirit, and also the culture, because if you're not part of the city, you don't necessarily know the kind of culture that you're going to encounter there. And so the fact that Anna Marie from the Hague Center is also part of our core group in the Integral City, naturally we're weaving together and finding ways that we both influence how we approach things and what we discover, and then bringing that back. So yeah, thanks for bringing up the systemic constellation work.
And I would say that like in relation to that, so for me, I think I'm always looking for ways to what I said, like to have both the self-organizing and the structures and hierarchies, and to have, let's say, to work in this emergent way, and to listen to the emerging future, and to try to like listen to the unknown, but also really bring it down to earth. And also like I also really like Excel sheets and Gantt charts, and like in that sense, the Integral City, the maps and the compass and the mesh and the hive, like they offer great, like that those are great tools of understanding, I would say, and also structuring information that you get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank
and
you.
Also to know where, like, and also to know sort of, it also gives, like, it's both a tool for understanding and a tool for design, let's say.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I really appreciate getting that feedback from you, because when we talk about the systemic constellation work, it's really one of the processes by which we can tap into the self-organizing aspects of Integral City. But as you point to the maps and the GPS with all of the intelligences, that is a way to notice the structures, the patterns that emerge, and that I hear you saying that is a valuable way for you to be able to see the patterns, to be able, as an architect, as an artist, to be able to notice the living patterns that are there. And I feel that that's really important to have a translator for that work, because they're fractal, they kind of stack, and they're holographic. They give images of the whole. Yeah. So Peter, thank you so much for sharing how you're using this in many different ways and still exploring. And I don't think it sounds like you have put it to bed and said, okay, I've done that. Now we can move on to the next thing. I think you're, a living example of, as I said, when I discovered work, well, I guess this is my life work. It's not going to have an end. It has so much to continue to both enlighten me and hopefully others. And as I started out with the interview, I said that we were now moving from waking up to growing up. And I think that this series of interviews that I would like to do with our community of practice will give us the stories of how we've moved from waking up to our first encounters and to how we're growing up and applying it in our work. So in order to maybe close our conversation for today, I'd like to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to share with others who are either contemplating doing the work or already doing it, and something that just feels that you feel like you'd like to share with them?
No, I don't know. I mean, like you said, this is something that doesn't, that's something this is something that keeps growing. Like, just, I think my experience is just, this is too much to really take in at once. Like, it's very hard to grasp it from the start. So just starting to work with it and starting to, and it's starting to, become richer, and you start to see more and more and more. It's like it's like learning another language. Like, I think in a way that's one of, if I look at sort of my what I've been doing in my life so far, and a lot of it is trying to learn different languages. Like, try to learn enough architecture to speak with architects, even though I couldn't. I'm not an architect, I'm not an urbanist, I don't have that knowledge, but I have just enough to be able to speak with them and maybe bring in some of the other languages. And I speak art to a certain extent, and I speak science to a certain extent, and so that for me, in a way, like, sometimes I think I'm just learning new languages and able to translate.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful way for us to sort of bring an image to the ways that you've interacted with Integral City. You started out by sharing that you're a translator, and now you're translating across the taxonomy, the lexicon, the technical things that necessarily a new paradigm uses to describe a new way, but also the processes and the people and the sectors. And so I would say that.
And one thing what I do want to say is, like, I really like the metaphor of the bees. There is so much in that, and even if it's just the buzzing of it, the idea of just this buzzing energy, but also the idea of collective intelligence. Like, I really I think we're really moving to the time of collective intelligence rather than individual genius. Like, if my ambition is to be part of an intelligent whole.
Beautiful.
And I think the bees are a really good metaphor for that.
Yes, I'm so happy you didn't leave the bees out, because I learned after I started to do the framing of the intelligences, when I wrote the first book, you'll perhaps remember that at the beginning of every chapter, there is a quotation from the world of the bees, because biomimicry has helped me to understand those four voices. The four voices fit quite nicely into the integral 4-quadrant frames, but actually, I learned them first from the bees and how they achieve their we space. So that's something else that you mentioned, that we have had the experience in our community of practice, but that's also something that I aspire to in conceiving how cities become human hives, and therefore we spaces for the human systems that are enclosed and embraced in the city. So I really feel that the kinds of ways that you're translating even human speak into bee speak, the buzz, that's another way of us to also realize that we can learn from other species as well as the patterns that are unfolding in our own behaviors and our psychologies and our cultures and our systems. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe my favorite story that you tell me is that I learned about the bees is that in its lifetime, a honeybee produces 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey. And that is, to know that is like, you can take so many lessons from that story. And one of it is, I think it warns you against being too, like thinking too much of yourself, but also at the same time, it's really comforting for me to know that I don't need to do it alone. If I make my 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey and others do theirs, then look what's possible.
Beautiful. Thank you, Peter. This is the perfect place for us to conclude our interview today. And I just have so much appreciated the stories that you've shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you.